Captain Edward John Smith remains one of the most recognizable maritime figures in modern history, forever linked with the tragic sinking of RMS Titanic in April 1912. Smith's name has become inseparable from one of the deadliest and most famous maritime disasters ever recorded. Yet long before Titanic sailed from Southampton on its ill-fated maiden voyage, Edward Smith had spent decades building a reputation as one of the most experienced, respected, and admired captains in the British merchant marine. To many of his contemporaries, Smith represented the ideal Edwardian sea captain, calm under pressure, deeply knowledgeable, disciplined, and dignified. Wealthy passengers specifically requested voyages aboard his ships because they trusted him completely. Crew members admired his professionalism, while the White Star Line viewed him as one of the crown jewels of the company. But history often remembers people for a single event rather than the entirety of their lives. The sinking of Titanic transformed Captain Smith from a celebrated maritime commander into a controversial historical figure whose decisions continue to be debated more than a century later. This biography explores the complete life of Captain Edward J. Smith. From his modest beginnings in the English Midlands to his rise as the commander of the world's most luxurious ocean liners, and ultimately to the freezing North Atlantic night that defined his legacy forever. Edward John Smith was born on January 27, 1850, in Hanley, Staffordshire, England. Hanley later became part of Stoke-on-Trent, an industrial region famous for pottery manufacturing. Smith came from a working-class family during a period when Britain was experiencing enormous industrial and imperial expansion. His father, Edward Smith, worked as a potter, while his mother, Catherine Hancock Smith, managed the household. The Smith family lived modestly, and young Edward grew up surrounded by the smoke, heat, and labor of England's industrial heartland. Unlike many future naval officers who came from aristocratic or naval traditions, Smith's upbringing was ordinary. He attended the British school in Etruria, where he received a basic education, though not considered exceptionally academic. Smith was known for his steady temperament and strong sense of responsibility. As a teenager, he worked briefly at the Etruria Forge, a local industrial works. However, Britain's maritime world offered opportunities that inland factory life could not. During the 19th century, the British Empire depended heavily on merchant shipping, and ambitious young men often sought careers at sea. At age 17, Smith decided to leave Staffordshire and pursue a maritime career. This decision would permanently alter the course of his life. In 1867, Edward Smith traveled to Liverpool, one of the busiest ports in the world. Liverpool stood at the center of global trade and passenger travel, serving as a gateway between Britain, North America, and countless colonial territories. Smith apprenticed with the shipping firm Gibson & Co. and began learning the demanding realities of life at sea. Apprenticeship in the merchant marine was harsh and physically exhausting. Young sailors endured long voyages, dangerous weather, cramped conditions, and strict discipline. Smith initially served aboard sailing ships, including vessels carrying goods to South America and other distant regions. These years taught him navigation, seamanship, cargo management, and leadership. During the late 19th century, maritime technology was rapidly evolving. Traditional sailing vessels were increasingly being replaced by steam-powered ships. Smith entered the profession during this transformative era and successfully adapted to changing technologies. By 1875, Smith had earned his master's certificate, an important qualification that allowed him to command ships. Achieving this certification required passing rigorous examinations covering navigation, astronomy, ship handling, and maritime law. Smith's steady rise reflected not only competence, but also reliability. Shipping companies valued captains who inspired confidence and maintained discipline without unnecessary cruelty. In 1880, Edward Smith joined the White Star Line, one of Britain's premier passenger shipping companies. Founded in the mid-19th century, White Star had become famous for operating luxurious transatlantic liners carrying passengers between Europe and North America. At the time Smith joined, the company was expanding rapidly. Ocean travel had become increasingly important for immigration, business, and tourism. Millions crossed the Atlantic searching for opportunity in the United States and Canada. Smith began as a fourth officer aboard the SS Celtic. White Star recognized his professionalism and promoted him steadily through the ranks. Life aboard ocean liners demanded exceptional organizational ability. Captains supervised navigation, cargo, passenger safety, crew discipline, and communication with company officials. They also served as social figures among wealthy passengers. Smith excelled in all areas. By 1887, he had received command of his first White Star vessel, the SS Republic. Over time, he commanded several ships, including the Baltic, Adriatic, and Germanic. Smith developed a reputation for calm leadership and exceptional judgment. Unlike some captains known for aggression or arrogance, Smith projected quiet authority. Passengers trusted him instinctively. He also became known for his impressive physical appearance. Tall, bearded, and dignified, Smith fit the public image of the ideal British sea captain. As White Star entered the golden age of luxury liners, Smith rose alongside the company. Despite his demanding career, Edward Smith maintained a stable family life. On July 12, 1887, he married Sarah Eleanor Pennington in Winwick, Lancashire. Sarah came from a respectable family and provided stability during Smith's long absences at sea. The couple eventually settled in Southampton, England, which had become White Star Line's primary operating port. In 1898, their daughter Helen Melville Smith was born. Friends and acquaintances often describe Smith as reserved but kind. While he maintained professional discipline aboard ship, at home he reportedly enjoyed a peaceful domestic life. However, the career of a transatlantic captain involved frequent separations from family. Ocean crossings could last weeks, and captains often spent much of the year at sea. Despite these challenges, Smith achieved financial comfort unusual for someone from his working-class origins. His success symbolized the social mobility possible within Britain's expanding maritime economy. As Smith gained seniority, White Star assigned him increasingly prestigious ships. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, transatlantic liners had become floating palaces for wealthy travelers. Industrialists, politicians, aristocrats, and celebrities crossed the Atlantic aboard these luxurious vessels. Smith became especially popular among first-class passengers. He earned the nickname the Millionaire's Captain because wealthy passengers specifically requested voyages under his command. His calm demeanor reassured nervous travelers, while his professionalism impressed elite clientele. Unlike naval officers, merchant captains often interacted socially with passengers. Smith attended dinners, greeted guests, and represented the prestige of the White Star Line. His growing fame coincided with fierce competition between shipping companies. White Star Line and Cunard Line competed intensely for speed, luxury, and prestige. Although Cunard focused heavily on speed records, White Star emphasized comfort, elegance, and reliability. Smith embodied these values perfectly. Smith also served in the Royal Naval Reserve, a force composed of merchant mariners who could support the Royal Navy during wartime. This service reflected Britain's strategic reliance on experienced civilian sailors. During the Second Boer War between Britain and South Africa from 1899 to 1902, Smith transported troops aboard White Star vessels. This role highlighted the strategic importance of merchant shipping during imperial conflicts. Though not a combat officer in the traditional sense, Smith's logistical contributions supported British military operations overseas. His service further enhanced his standing within both maritime and national circles. As maritime technology advanced, ocean liners grew dramatically larger and more luxurious. White Star Line entered a new era with the construction of enormous ships designed to dominate transatlantic travel. Smith commanded several famous vessels during this period, including the RMS Majestic, RMS Baltic, RMS Adriatic, and RMS Olympic. Olympic deserves particular attention because it served as Titanic's sister ship. Launched in 1910, Olympic represented a revolution in passenger travel. Massive, luxurious, and technologically advanced, it symbolized British industrial confidence. Smith captained Olympic on its maiden voyage and gained valuable experience handling these giant liners. However, Olympic's career under Smith was not entirely free from controversy. In September 1911, Olympic collided with the British warship HMS Hawke near the Isle of Wight, although both ships survived. The accident sparked debate regarding responsibility. Investigations ultimately blamed Olympic. Critics later pointed to the Hawke collision when examining Smith's decisions aboard Titanic. Supporters argued that accidents involving large ships were complex and not solely attributable to captains. Regardless, White Star retained confidence in Smith. When Titanic prepared for her maiden voyage in 1912, there was little question regarding who would command the ship. Captain Edward J. Smith, White Star's most famous and trusted captain, received the honor. RMS Titanic was built at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Ireland. At the time of her completion, Titanic was among the largest moving objects ever created by human beings. The ship measured approximately 882 feet in length and featured extraordinary luxury. First-class passengers enjoyed grand staircases, Turkish baths, libraries, smoking rooms, fine dining salons, squash courts, and lavish suites. The vessel represented far more than transportation. Titanic symbolized technological progress, industrial power, and Edwardian confidence. White Star marketed the ship as the pinnacle of comfort and safety, though the phrase unsinkable was exaggerated by media and public enthusiasm rather than official company claims. Many people genuinely believed modern engineering had conquered the dangers of the sea. Smith, nearing retirement at age 62, likely viewed Titanic as the crowning achievement of his career. Many historians believe the voyage was intended to be his final major command before retirement. On April 10, 1912, Titanic departed Southampton. Crowds gathered to witness the historic sailing. Aboard were more than 2,200 passengers and crew, representing a wide range of social classes and nationalities. The mood was optimistic. Few could imagine the catastrophe awaiting in the North Atlantic. The early days of Titanic's voyage appeared successful. After leaving Southampton, the ship stopped briefly at Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, Ireland, now known as Cove. Passengers included some of the wealthiest individuals in the world. Along with immigrants seeking new lives in America, Captain Smith performed his duties with customary professionalism. Survivor accounts generally described him as calm, courteous, and confident during the voyage. Titanic traveled westward across the Atlantic at high speed. During the voyage, nearby ships transmitted multiple ice warnings via wireless radio. These warnings indicated dangerous ice fields and drifting icebergs in Titanic's path. Exactly how Smith interpreted and acted upon these warnings remains heavily debated. Some historians argue that maintaining speed through icy waters reflected common maritime practice at the time. Others believe greater caution should have been exercised. At the beginning of the 20th century, captains often prioritized schedules and believed experienced lookouts could identify hazards in time. Fortunately, conditions on the night of April 14, 1912, were unusually dangerous. The sea was calm, the air was cold, and the moonless night made icebergs difficult to detect. At approximately 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, lookout Frederick Fleet spotted an iceberg directly ahead. He rang the warning bell and telephoned the bridge. First Officer William Murdoch immediately ordered evasive maneuvers. Titanic began turning, but the massive vessel could not avoid collision completely. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side of the ship, damaging multiple watertight compartments below the waterline. Initially, many passengers barely noticed the impact. But below deck, seawater rapidly entered the ship. Captain Smith quickly consulted Titanic's designer Thomas Andrews and senior officers. The conclusion was devastating. Titanic would sink. The ship's watertight compartment system had been overwhelmed because too many sections were flooding simultaneously. Smith now faced the greatest crisis of his life. Captain Smith ordered distress signals transmitted and instructed the crew to prepare lifeboats. Unfortunately, Titanic carried lifeboats for only about half the people aboard. Although this number technically met outdated maritime regulations, it proved catastrophically insufficient. The evacuation quickly descended into confusion. Many passengers initially refused to enter lifeboats because they believed the giant liner remained safer than small wooden boats. Crew training for evacuation procedures had been limited. Communication difficulties emerged across different areas of the ship. Smith reportedly moved throughout the vessel, issuing orders, assisting officers, and attempting to maintain calm. Witness testimony regarding Smith's exact actions during the sinking varies considerably. Some survivors recalled him remaining composed and encouraging evacuation efforts. Others described moments of shock and emotional exhaustion. One frequently repeated statement attributed to Smith was, "Be British, boys, be British." However, historians continue debating whether he actually spoke those words. As Titanic's condition worsened, the ship tilted increasingly toward the bow. Lifeboats departed partially filled during the early stages of evacuation, a tragic consequence of uncertainty and poor coordination. Musicians famously continued performing to calm passengers. Wireless operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride continued sending distress calls as long as possible. Nearby ships attempted to respond, but help remained too distant. Around 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, Titanic finally broke apart and disappeared beneath the Atlantic. More than 1,500 people lost their lives in freezing waters. It remains one of the deadliest peacetime maritime disasters in history. Captain Smith perished with Titanic. His body was never recovered. The exact circumstances of his death remain uncertain. Numerous survivor accounts conflicted with one another. Some witnesses claimed Smith was seen on the bridge as the ship went down. Others alleged he entered the water and attempted to help swimmers. One account suggested he carried a child toward a lifeboat. Because of the chaos and darkness, historians cannot determine precisely how Smith spent his final moments. What appears clear is that he chose not to seek personal survival. Like many captains of the era, Smith followed the maritime tradition that a captain remains with his ship during disaster. Whether viewed as heroic duty or tragic inevitability, his death cemented his symbolic association with Titanic forever. News of Titanic's sinking shocked the world. The disaster dominated international headlines for weeks. Public grief, mixed with anger and disbelief. Captain Smith initially received sympathetic treatment from many newspapers, which portrayed him as a brave commander overwhelmed by unprecedented tragedy. However, criticism soon emerged. Investigations in both the United States and Britain examined the disaster extensively. Questions focused on several key issues. Why had Titanic maintained high speed despite ice warnings? Why were there insufficient lifeboats? Why had evacuation procedures been inadequate? Could the disaster have been avoided? Because Smith died in the sinking, he could neither defend his decisions nor provide testimony. As a result, historians have debated his responsibility ever since. Some scholars argue Smith became a convenient scapegoat for broader systemic failures involving maritime regulations, company culture, and industry overconfidence. Others believe he made critical errors in judgment that contributed directly to the catastrophe. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. Titanic's sinking resulted from a complex combination of human error, technological limitations, environmental conditions, and institutional shortcomings. The Titanic disaster transformed maritime safety worldwide. In the years following the sinking, major reforms were implemented. New international regulations required sufficient lifeboats for all passengers aboard ships. Continuous wireless radio monitoring became mandatory. The International Ice Patrol was established to monitor iceberg dangers in the North Atlantic. Safety drills and evacuation procedures improved significantly. These reforms emerged directly from the lessons of Titanic. Although Captain Smith's reputation remains controversial, the disaster he was associated with ultimately helped save countless future lives through improved safety standards. More than a century later, Captain Edward J. Smith continues to fascinate historians, filmmakers, and the public. His image has appeared in countless books, documentaries, television programs, and films. Perhaps the most famous portrayal came in James Cameron's 1997 film Titanic, where actor Bernard Hill depicted Smith as a weary, dignified captain confronting unimaginable catastrophe. Public opinion about Smith remains divided. To some, he represents professionalism and duty under impossible circumstances. To others, he symbolizes the arrogance and overconfidence of the Edwardian age. Modern historians generally avoid simplistic portrayals. Smith was neither an infallible hero nor a reckless villain. He was an experienced sea captain, operating within the assumptions and practices of his era. Many maritime customs considered acceptable in 1912 would later be recognized as dangerously inadequate. The world in which Smith worked valued speed, prestige, and confidence in technological progress. Titanic's sinking shattered those assumptions. Accounts from those who knew Smith consistently emphasized several personal qualities. He was disciplined but approachable, maintained authority without excessive harshness. Passengers frequently praised his calm manner, Crew members respected his professionalism. Unlike flamboyant or aggressive commanders, Smith projected steadiness. His leadership style reflected the ideals of late Victorian and Edwardian Britain: duty, restraint, composure, and hierarchy. However, some historians argue these same qualities may have limited adaptability during crisis. The culture of absolute confidence surrounding major liners perhaps discouraged caution. Smith had spent decades successfully commanding ships across the Atlantic. Such long-term success may have reinforced trust in established procedures. Unfortunately, Titanic encountered circumstances where traditional assumptions failed catastrophically. Because Titanic occupies such a powerful place in popular culture, myths surrounding Captain Smith have multiplied over time. Several stories remain disputed or unsupported by evidence. For example, some legends claim Smith ignored repeated iceberg warnings while attending social events. Others portray him as emotionally paralyzed after the collision. Historical evidence for these claims is limited. Similarly, dramatic stories about Smith's final moments vary wildly. This uncertainty reflects the chaotic nature of the disaster itself. Many eyewitness accounts contradicted one another, and memories changed over time. As a result, separating fact from legend remains difficult. Nevertheless, these stories contribute to the enduring fascination surrounding both Smith and Titanic. One reason Captain Smith continues to resonate historically is because his story feels profoundly human. He spent decades building a reputation for competence and reliability. He rose from modest origins to command the greatest ships in the world. By all accounts, he expected Titanic to represent the triumphant conclusion of his career. Instead, the voyage became a global tragedy. The contrast between Titanic's promise and its destruction gives Smith's biography a deeply dramatic quality. He symbolizes both the extraordinary achievements and dangerous overconfidence of the industrial age. Even today, people continue asking the same haunting questions. Could the disaster have been prevented? Should Smith have slowed the ship? Did he fully understand the danger posed by ice? Could anyone have realistically avoided catastrophe under those conditions? These questions ensure that Smith remains a subject of historical debate rather than simple historical judgment. Captain Edward J. Smith lived during an era when the oceans connected empires, industries, and millions of human lives. From humble beginnings in Staffordshire, he rose to become one of Britain's most celebrated merchant captains. He commanded some of the largest and most luxurious ships ever built and earned the trust of passengers around the world. For decades, his career appeared to embody the success and confidence of the British maritime tradition. Yet history remembers him primarily for one terrible night in April 1912. The sinking of Titanic transformed Smith from a respected sea captain into an enduring historical figure associated with tragedy, heroism, controversy, and human fallibility. More than 100 years later, Captain Edward J. Smith remains central to the story of Titanic because his life reflects larger themes about ambition, technology, leadership, and mortality. He stood at the helm of a ship that represented humanity's faith and progress. When Titanic disappeared beneath the Atlantic, that faith was shaken forever. And with it, Captain Edward J. Smith passed from ordinary history into legend. Until the next video, take care.